Hey everyone, and welcome back to AI Paper Podcasts. Today we're going to be taking a look at this paper, LIMO. Less is more for reasoning.
Oh, yeah. This is a really interesting one.
It's got some pretty crazy results, I think. Some stuff that I think a lot of people didn't expect to see.
Yeah, it kind of turns some assumptions on their head about how much data you need to train these models.
Yeah, and I mean, to jump right into it, they built a model that gets, what was it, 50-something% accuracy on A?
57.1%. Yeah, and A is no joke. Like, that's a seriously hard benchmark for mathematical reasoning.
Yeah, like that's like you think about high school math competitions. Like that's getting into like the upper echelon.
Yeah, and they did this with only 817 training examples, which is crazy when you compare it to other models.
Yeah, like 1% of the data that some other models have used.
And even more impressive is that LIMO actually beat models trained on 100 times more data on out-of-distribution tests.
Yeah, which really suggests that it's not just memorizing patterns, like it's actually learning how to reason.
Right. It's able to generalize and apply its knowledge to new problems it hasn't seen before.
Which is amazing. So what's the secret sauce here? What's allowing them to do this with so little data?
Well, they have this really interesting hypothesis. They call it the LIMO Hypothesis.
Right.
And it basically says that sophisticated reasoning comes from two key factors. The first is a really strong pre-trained knowledge foundation.
Okay, like those massive language models that are trained on these gigantic data sets.
Exactly, like ones that have been trained on tons and tons of mathematical content. So the knowledge is already there. The challenge is getting the model to use it effectively.
Right. It's like it has all the textbooks, but it doesn't know how to apply any of that knowledge yet.
Exactly. And that's where the second factor comes in. They call them cognitive templates.
Okay.
And basically, it's just high-quality training examples that show the model how to apply that knowledge.
So instead of just giving it more and more facts, you're giving it a few really good examples of how to solve problems.
Right. You're showing it the reasoning process, the steps involved in solving a problem.
It's almost like giving it a cheat sheet, but not with the answers, but with the strategies for finding the answers.
Yes, exactly. And this really challenges this comic belief that supervised fine-tuning just leads to memorization.
Right.
It shows that you can actually get true generalization even with a limited amount of data.
Which is super exciting.
Yeah.
So let's dig into the paper itself.
Okay.
So the authors start off by sort of setting the stage, talking about how traditionally the assumption has been that you need massive data sets for complex reasoning.
Right. I mean, we've seen models trained on hundreds of thousands, even millions of examples.
Yeah. It's incredibly resource intensive and it's not always practical.
Right.
So what changed? What allowed the LIMO researchers to do this with so little data?
Well, they point to two key developments that have really revolutionized the field. The first one they call the knowledge foundation revolution. And it's basically that modern foundation models are now pre-trained on truly massive amounts of data, including a ton of mathematical content.
So that's like the Llama 2s of the world and stuff like that.
Exactly. They're being fed so much data during pre-training that they're already developing a pretty sophisticated understanding of math.
It's like they already have a PhD in math, but they haven't learned how to apply it to real-world problems yet.
Exactly, and that's a great way to put it.
So what's the second revolution?
The second one is what they call the inference-time computation scaling revolution.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. But basically it means that we now have techniques that allow these models to handle much longer reasoning chains when they're trying to solve a problem.
So it's like giving them more processing power, more memory to work with.
Exactly. It's giving them the cognitive workspace they need to work through those complex steps.
Okay, so it's like giving them a bigger whiteboard to work out the problem on. Okay, so now let's get to the heart of the paper and unpack the LIMO hypothesis itself. You said it has two core components, right?
Yeah. So first you have the pre-trained knowledge foundation that we've been talking about. The model already has this vast amount of mathematical knowledge thanks to these huge pre-training data sets.
Right, so it's not about adding more information at this point. It's about accessing and applying what's already there.
Right, and the second component is those 817 training examples.
Right, those cognitive templates.
Exactly. And these examples, instead of teaching the model new mathematical concepts, they act as demonstrations of the reasoning process itself.
So they show the model how to take that existing knowledge and apply it to solve specific types of problems.
Exactly. And the quality of these examples is really important. They need to be well structured, and they need to demonstrate the process of problem solving, not just the solution.
So it's not just about showing them the answer, it's about showing them how to get to the answer.
Right. It's like giving a student examples of how to solve different types of math problems rather than just giving them more equations to memorize.
Okay, so it sounds like the LIMO dataset itself is pretty unique. How did the researchers go about creating it, especially with this focus on quality over quantity?
Well, they took a very deliberate approach. First, they focused on question selection. They wanted to make sure they were choosing problems that were actually challenging.
Okay.
And that would force the model to think outside its usual patterns. They call these out-of-distribution problems.
So they're really pushing the model to generalize its knowledge.
Exactly. And where did they find these problems?
Yeah, where do you even get these problems?
Well, they started with a huge pool of tens of millions of potential problems.
Wow.
And then they used a multi-stage filtration process. They actually used existing large language models to filter out the problems that were too easy.
Okay, so they were really trying to pick out the most challenging ones?
Exactly. They wanted to make sure they were left with just the most challenging and diverse set of problems possible.
So they created like an obstacle course for the model's brain.
Exactly.
So once they had these super challenging questions, how did they create the solutions?
That's where it gets really interesting. They focused on something they called reasoning chain construction.
Okay.
They wanted solutions that were not only correct, but also extremely well structured, and they called it cognitive scaffolding for the model.
Okay.
And what that means is that the solutions included explanations for each step. They showed how different concepts connected, and they even included lots of verification steps where the solution double checks its own work.
Wow. So it's like they're teaching the model to think like a mathematician, showing their work, checking their assumptions, and making sure everything logically flows together.
Exactly. And it's this combination of those really challenging questions and those high-quality, meticulously constructed solutions that makes the LIMO dataset so powerful.
That's amazing. Okay, so now...
So before the break, we were really getting into the nuts and bolts of the LIMO paper.
Yeah, this whole idea of less is more for reasoning.
And how it kind of challenges the way we've traditionally thought about training these large language models for mathematical reasoning.
Yeah, this assumption that you just need more and more data.
Right, bigger models, bigger data sets, that's been the mantra for a long time.
But LIMO seems to be saying, oh, hold on a second, maybe there's a more efficient way.
Exactly, and I think it's really helpful to see where LIMO fits into the context of all this previous research on mathematical reasoning.
Right, like how does it build on what's already been done?
Yeah, so the authors do a really good job of kind of tracing the history of this field.
Okay.
You know how it started with this focus on scaling up both model size and training data?
Right.
The idea was that the more data you could feed these models, the better they would get at reasoning.
Yeah, it's like the classic practice makes perfect approach, right?
Right, and it worked to a certain extent, but I think what we're seeing now with LIMO is that maybe we're hitting a point of diminishing returns.
Okay.
Like these pre-training data sets have gotten so massive that they already contain a ton of mathematical knowledge.
Right, it's like they've already read all the textbooks.
Exactly. So it's not about cramming in more information, it's about figuring out how to activate and leverage what's already there.
So how do they propose we do that?
Well, they highlight a few interesting research directions. One is this idea of using specialized corpora during pre-training.
Okay.
So instead of just feeding the model a bunch of random text, you could focus on giving it things like math textbooks, scientific papers, even mathematical code.
Okay, so kind of curating the data a bit more carefully.
Exactly. The idea is to expose the model to a wider variety of mathematical thinking.
So it's not just memorizing formulas, it's actually learning how to think like a mathematician.
Right. And they also point out the limitations of just scaling up instruction data, which is what a lot of past research has focused on.
Okay.
You know, giving the model more and more examples of problems and solutions.
Right.
But even if those examples are high quality, it doesn't necessarily mean the model is actually understanding the concepts.
Yeah, it could just be memorizing patterns.
Right. And the paper actually cites some research showing that this is happening with some current models.
Okay.
They perform well on problems that are similar to the ones they were trained on.
Right.
But then they struggle when they're faced with new challenges that require them to actually reason.
Right. It's like they can't think outside the box.
Exactly.
Right.
LIMO, on the other hand, seems to be able to generalize its knowledge and apply it to new situations, even with that limited training data.
So it's not just about brute forcing our way to better reasoning with more and more data.
Right.
LIMO is suggesting a more nuanced approach that focuses on the quality of the reasoning process itself.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And this actually connects to another interesting area of research that the paper discusses, which is test time scaling.
Okay, test time scaling, what is that?
So basically, it's about increasing the amount of computation that the model is allowed to do when it's trying to solve a problem. Not just during training, but at test time.
Okay.
So you're giving the model more time to think, more resources to work with.
It's like giving a student extra time on an exam.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
And the paper mentions techniques like parallel sampling and symbolic tree search as ways to do this.
Okay, and this all ties into those longer reasoning chains that we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like those longer reasoning chains are crucial for solving complex problems.
Right.
And test time scaling is what allows the model to actually handle those longer chains.
It gives them the computational space to do it.
Exactly.
And the paper also talks about using reinforcement learning to actually train models to generate those longer and more complex chains of thought.
Yeah, that's another really cool area of research that's gaining a lot of traction.
Okay.
And the idea is that you reward the model for generating chains of thought that are not only accurate, but also well-structured and detailed.
Okay, so not just getting the right answer, but explaining how you got there.
Exactly, and including things like those self-reflection and verification steps that we were talking about.
Right, so it's like the model is checking its own work.
Exactly, and the authors argue that these longer, more complex chains of thought, especially the ones that are generated through reinforcement learning, are particularly effective at activating those latent reasoning capabilities that are already present in the pre-trained models.
So it's like you're not teaching the model new things, you're just helping it unlock the potential that's already there.
Right, and it's really this combination of that high-quality pre-training, those carefully curated examples, and these clever techniques like test time scaling that makes LIMO so powerful.
That's amazing. But LIMO is also kind of building on this other really interesting trend that we've been seeing in the field, right? This focus on data efficiency.
Right.
Like we all remember the impact that the LIMO paper had.
Oh, yeah.
Like showing that you could get these amazing results in language modeling using just a tiny data set.
Right. LIMO was a real game changer in terms of highlighting the importance of data quality over quantity.
And it seems like LIMO is taking that same less is more philosophy and applying it to the world of reasoning.
Exactly. They're showing that you don't necessarily need mountains of data to unlock complex reasoning in AI.
Which is really exciting, but I'm sure there are also some limitations to this approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, one obvious question is how well this generalizes to other domains.
Right. Math is a very structured domain with clear right and wrong answers.
Right.
So would this same approach work for something like legal reasoning or ethical decision-making?
That's a great question, and it's something that future research will need to explore.
Yeah.
Like, can we develop similar cognitive templates for other domains? And if so, what would those templates even look like?
Right.
Those are really interesting open questions.
And the paper also talks about some other really exciting directions for future research.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, they specifically mention exploring how applicable LIMO is to things like scientific reasoning, logical deduction, and causal inference.
Yeah, and they also emphasize the need to develop a deeper theoretical understanding of why LIMO works so well.
So not just showing that it works, but actually understanding the mechanisms behind it.
Right, and another area they highlight is the need for better tools to automate the assessment of reasoning chain quality.
Okay.
Right now, it's a very manual process, which is time-consuming and difficult to scale.
So it's a bottleneck if we want to apply this approach to more complex problems and larger data sets.
Exactly, and they also suggest exploring how to integrate multimodal information into the reasoning process. Things like visuals and structured data.
Okay, so taking it beyond just text.
Right, it would be really interesting to see how LIMO could be extended to handle those types of data.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to be done, but the LIMO paper definitely provides a really compelling vision for the future of AI.
I agree.
This idea that we can achieve sophisticated reasoning abilities with fewer resources than we thought possible.
And I think it's a really important reminder that we're just scratching the surface of what's possible with these large language models.
Yeah, who knows what other amazing capabilities are just waiting to be unlocked. So we've spent a good amount of time unpacking this LIMO paper.
Yeah, really digging into the details of this less is more approach to reasoning.
And I think it's time to kind of zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture.
Right, like what are the implications of all this?
Yeah, like if we can achieve these impressive reasoning capabilities with such small data sets, what else might be possible?
Right. It's almost like we've been trying to build a skyscraper with just bricks and mortar.
Okay.
And then suddenly someone hands us this blueprint for using steel and glass.
Wow, yeah, so we've been doing things the hard way.
And LIMO is like this paradigm shift.
It's saying, hey, there's a more efficient way to do this.
Exactly. And it really makes you wonder what other AI capabilities might be just waiting to be unlocked.
Right, like if we could apply these same principles to things like creativity or intuition.
I mean, those are some big questions.
Yeah, but I think that's what makes this paper so exciting.
Definitely, it opens up all these new possibilities.
It's like a whole new frontier of AI research.
And I think it also raises some really interesting questions about the nature of learning itself.
Right, like are we thinking about AI training in the wrong way?
Maybe we've been too focused on just cramming in more and more data.
Yeah, like maybe it's not just about the quantity of knowledge, but about the way that knowledge is structured and accessed.
Right, and LIMO seems to be suggesting that maybe we need to shift our focus from memorization to understanding.
From rote learning to actual reasoning.
Exactly, and this has implications not just for AI, but for how we think about human learning as well.
Right, like we don't learn by just memorizing facts. We learn by building mental models, developing strategies for problem solving.
And maybe that's the key to truly intelligent AI as well.
Teaching it how to think, not just what to think.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful idea.
And it leads to this even bigger question, like, if we can achieve so much with so little data, what other capabilities are hiding within these large language models?
Right, like what other breakthroughs are just around the corner?
It's really mind-blowing to think about.
And I think the LIMO paper is a great example of how AI research can challenge our assumptions and push us to think in new ways.
It's definitely a paper that will be sparking conversations and inspiring new research for years to come.
Absolutely, it's a real game changer.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this episode of AI Paper Podcast.
It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, I always love digging into these cutting-edge papers with you.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time.